Hey guys, Montel here, and welcome to this edition of Let's Be Blunt with Montel. You know, the interest in psychedelic medicine, particularly psilocybin, a pro-drug derived from some 200 varieties of so-called magic mushrooms, stems from multiple factors. Notably, decades of research into psilocybin by reputable universities suggest it may offer therapeutic benefits for patients diagnosed with everything from traumatic brain injury to depression to anxiety, PTSD, and similar conditions. For example, back in 2019, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine opened a center for psychedelic and consciousness research in Baltimore. It's studying psilocybin as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, PTSD, smoking cessation, anorexia, depression. Studies also are planned for opioid addiction and post-treatment of Lyme disease. You know, and my guest today graduated from Cornell University with a degree in economics. And after graduating college, he worked briefly in the investment banking world before deciding to join the Army. He became an Army Ranger and served 3 combat tours, 3 combat deployments. After his military service professionally, he went back into high finance, but personally struggled with severe depression and anxiety. He's the president now and founder of the Heroic Hearts Project, a nonprofit dedicated to educating and connecting veterans with psychedelic treatments options. Mr. Jesse Gould, thanks so much for being a part of today's show, sir.
Montel, thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to meet you and talk with you today.
Absolutely. You know, in the last couple of years, this topic has kind of caught fire. So I'm really glad that we're having an opportunity to give some information out today to a lot of people who are suffering. And, you know, we're also living in a time when, you know, I've been saying this over and over again here on not only Let's Be Blunt, but another podcast I have, it's called Free Thinking, that, you know, what people don't recognize is that though we seem to be coming out of one pandemic, we are about to head into, I think, which will be the biggest pandemic facing mankind. It has a pandemic of mental health issues that are being suffered by millions in this country and millions around the world. Not only the survivors of, let's say, COVID, who spent days, months, in, you know, multiple months in the hospital battling for their lives, but, you know, those who were the caretakers, from the doctors to the first responders to the nurses. And then we look at, you know, our veteran community that literally has wallowed on the fence in the last year and a half because so much attention was placed on COVID that we forgot that we're still looking at a veteran suicide rate of somewhere between 19 and 22 a day. And though the civilian suicide rate, which a lot of people are not willing to even address, look at, is somewhere around 130 a day. So this is something that we're going to be faced with for the next few years. And if there are options out there that heretofore were not considered, you know, legitimate, they're being considered legitimate today. And I'm glad that you're here to talk about them, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. And if you look at sort of the mental health landscape, there really hasn't been huge innovations in the last 40 to 50 years. And what we're dealing with is almost a reemergence of this information. So whether it's cannabis, whether it's psychedelics, a lot of these substances were already studied in the 60s and the 70s, but it was because of fears, because of stigmas, because of policy, the drug war that just pushed them all underground. And it's somewhat of a tragedy because so many people have been suffering. And to your point, over the last 20 years plus, the veteran community has just been decimated by the suicide epidemic. And despite hundreds of billions of dollars going to suicide prevention, suicide awareness, the VA's numbers have not improved. I think the latest statistic was 4 out of the 5 last years, veteran suicides just increased. And so we're fortunate to be living in a time where we're starting to discuss cannabis, we're starting to discuss psychedelics, but it is still very trying that we got to this point where there's such a huge need. It's almost like the cup had to overflow first before we recognize that we need to start looking for other solutions.
And we also have to, unfortunately, I say it this way, and forgive me for those who are listening, but unfortunately, there are those people out there who have turned this into their own little cottage industry. Depression, anxiety, PTSD have all spawned industries that are worth billions of dollars, where they have been actually, perpetuating and perpetrating an injustice upon those who suffer by providing, you know, protocols that they know are less than 35% efficacious. And now I think the science is finally starting to catch up in areas like cannabis and psychedelics, where, reputable, universities and facilities around the world are starting to recognize the value of science that was, as you said, studied back in the 60s and the early 70s, where we recognize the efficaciousness of other agents that would do a better job than some of the stuff that they are shoving down our veterans' throats today. But because, it's a cottage industry, there are those who are deeply entrenched, civil servants and people who have been promoting some of these non-effective treatments that are fighting this tooth and nail.
Absolutely. And to your point, yeah, people with the antidepressants, antipsychotics, and what you see with veterans, it's not uncommon for veterans to be on multiple medications, which is the biggest tragedy. I know plenty of veterans that go through a program that at some point were on 15, 20 medications, because these things can be so powerful that they cause all these really bad side effects. A lot of them are psychosis. A lot of them are increased suicidal ideation. And this is not to speak bad across the board. There are some medications in moderation that have saved veteran lives, absolutely. But at the rate that they are prescribed, without sort of the actual monitoring it, or without the openness to viewing other modalities, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's cannabis, or even just wellness of life, that has been the biggest tragedy. For me, I like how it's almost come full circle, where billions, if not trillions of dollars have gone into fine tuning and developing these chemicals. And now we're coming back to nature, where we have these very powerful plants that are, doing the job way better than any of these designer sort of medications have been doing.
And I know you don't want to say anything disparaging, and please, I'm not going to try to force you to do so, but I got to tell you that I'm so sorry. I've been beating my head against the wall with protocols that, I've been working on and helping to champion, something called the RTM program, which we know has proven out now to be 90% plus efficacious in remitting almost all symptoms of PTSD, but it goes up against exposure therapy that's been used for 20 years or 15 years in the military and at the VA. And those who actually promote exposure therapy have been the biggest, impediment against RTM, because they don't want to lose their funding. And
Absolutely.
that comes into play to me to say that, there are people who are out here trying their best to make a living off of other suffering, when the truth should be to try to end the suffering.
Absolutely.
So, let's talk a little bit, my friend. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's start about, the beginning of your journey. What made you decide to join the military after having such a successful career in, the investment banking world after college?
Yeah, so I was pretty early into it, but I was surrounded by all these great, intelligent people. I had jobs in New York, and at the heart of the financial center of the world, and I really enjoyed it. But I also graduated around 2009, which was the big financial collapse, and New York was just it was an interesting time to be there, especially in finance, where thousands of people lost their job when Bear Stearns, Lehman went under. People were taking their own lives out of desperation. It was just a very interesting side, and it was all self-inflicted. It was all the result of greed, as we learn more and more about it. And so I found myself in a spot where I felt very fortunate of having gone to a great university and having been in this position and having sort of that upward mobility. But I also always had the sense that I wanted to give back to the country that allowed that to happen. And I always had that sort of, internal becoming a man sort of test my metal instinct. And the military just seemed like the right avenue for me to go. And, sometimes the universe aligns, where Wall Street was in this sort of devastated mode. So it wasn't, it wasn't like I was going to miss much, but it was also this sort of extreme exposure to greed and to self-interest versus what I wanted to create in my life. And so that it became a very clear message of the military might be the best way. And so, I looked into it and saw, these special operations unit, and it was very intriguing of, if you want to go in, that's the ultimate way to test yourself against who you are, your mental strength, your physical strength. And so I, to the worry of my family, which it kind of came out of left field, but fortunately, it brought us all together. And I definitely found what I was searching for through that experience. It definitely developed me into the person that I am today, with a much more, I think, nuanced understanding of how the world works and even how our country works.
Well, tell us a little bit about your time as an Army Ranger. I mean, you did do 3 deployments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went in. I wanted to be from the get-go a Ranger, just because if I was doing this big transition in life, I wanted to be the best trained I possibly could and surrounded by the best as well. So I went through airborne, went through selection, and fortunately was able to pass and got stationed in Savannah, Georgia, 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. And when you get in there, you feel all great about yourself, but then you just start at the bottom rung. And so then it was another learning process. But, I got great training. I was surrounded by great individuals. I was a mortarman there, and which, for people who don't know, it's a high angle trajectory rocket or explosive, which has a lot of math behind it. So it actually kind of fit well within it. But it was just a very interesting experience. All my deployments were in Afghanistan. I quickly became a non-commissioned officer because I enlisted. And so, it put me into this position of, this is where your training comes in. You have to be a leader. There's no question about it. And so there were a lot of, very profound transitions in, this is no longer play. This is no longer sort of the college bubble that I was in. This is real life, and your decisions and your faith in yourself is what is going to keep you going, and also those around you. And so, especially as a leader, especially as owning the ground that I walk on, it really was a transformative spot. And I was fortunate. I was surrounded by people. I wasn't necessarily in the crazy traumatic things that you might see in Hollywood. But no matter what, within the Ranger deployments, it's a very high action sort of commitment. When you're over there, you're constantly doing missions, and so no matter what, for everybody, it does transition your mind, which allows you to survive in a combat situation, but might not be ideal for the civilian world. And so I think that's after, when I left the military, that's when I really started hitting walls, because I was still sort of, I was molded to be a soldier. I was molded to be a part of this unit and in this very high octane, high stress situation. And then when you go into finance on the tail end, those two worlds don't necessarily line up. And so when I got out of the military, that's when a lot of these mental health issues, whether from experiential trauma or from our understanding now, I was exposed to a lot of concussive force from the mortar systems, from door breaches. So the physical impacts on my brain. But I just
talk a little bit about that, just so people can understand, the breadth of your deployments. I mean, you were on the front line, involved in several skirmishes and other face-to-face action, military action, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that don't know, Army Rangers are a special operations unit. So there's a few, each military unit has their own special operations. So a lot of people know Navy SEALs. You have Air Force pararescue jumpers. You have Marine Raiders. In the Army, you have 2. So Green Berets, which is Special Forces, and Army Rangers. And each have their own sort of expertise. So Army Rangers are the most elite infantry unit in the Army. And so they're very direct action. So essentially, Rangers will go in, they do raids, ambushes. Around the time I was going in, it's essentially you're finding people who are sort of the leaders of the terrorist networks, or like the generals or the IED makers that are just causing a lot of chaos in these countries. And so through intelligence, you're trying to locate them, find them, and disrupt sort of the networks. And so the Army Ranger lifestyle is nonstop. Essentially, we spend half the year training, half the year deploying, and so you're just constantly on this hamster wheel of And oftentimes the training is more intense than the deployments. Deployments can almost be a sort of sigh of relief because the op tempo is the operation speed is not as high. But no matter
a
what,
lot of people don't understand though. While you're doing these operations, you were there in a combat situation where there are multiple blasts going on around you. People don't understand the idea of traumatic brain injury. The fact that you don't have to literally be blown up by an IED. You can be 50 feet from an IED. You can be 100 feet from a mortar blast, and still it sends a shock wave across the ground that actually does a shock wave through your brain. Correct?
absolutely, and that's kind of the research. I suggest people look up Dr. Mark Gordon. He's done a lot of great research about this, and it's just sort of the constant, even if it's microabrasions to the brain, the constant exposure to that causes some damage, causes some disconnections within the brain, and if it doesn't have time to heal, it compounds. And so, especially in a training environment where we're shooting mortars, and that concussive force just it almost shakes your brain in not necessarily a healthy way, but just the training. So whether it's door breaches, you have that concussive force, you have even high caliber rounds, it's constant bombardment of your brain. And so you're seeing a lot of veterans that they might have PTSD, but there's also this whole other dynamic of brain trauma that's not being factored in because it's very underdiagnosed. And so it's very similar to what we're seeing with athletes. With athletes, we can kind of comprehend it because, a football player, hockey player, they're hitting their head against other guys. We understand the physical concussion. But what you see with athletes is that there is also a high suicide rate. There's a high depression rate post their athletic career, and it's not being addressed either. And you're seeing very similar symptoms with military veterans because of that exposure to actual things that physically damage the brain. So that combined with all the other factors, whether it's chemical exposure, whether it's the traumatic events, that cause PTSD, and just also when you're in this deployed situation, you're constantly on alert. Like you said, even if you're on a secure base, there's mortars always being lobbed in. There's all sorts of different stuff at any given time. You're on guard, and so in terms of hormone level, your cortisol levels get sort of permanently stuck on this on switch. And so that's why veterans tend to have this hypervigilance. That's why a lot of their hormones get unbalanced, just because you're in this very artificial situation in this constant life or death mode, which our bodies are not necessarily built to be in for that extended period of time. We're built to have quick reactions to danger, not prolonged reactions to danger.
Absolutely. And after your military service, so talk a little bit about what was it like the transition when you first came back? What was it like to transition back to civilian life?
I was ready. I was ready to like pound my chest. Like I had this Ranger background. Nothing could stop me. I was feeling good. I was in good shape. I had my Cornell degree, and so I thought I would just hit the ground running and I possibly go into finance, possibly start my own business. I was fortunately able to travel a little bit, and so I just really enjoyed it. Um, but then sort of reality sunk in of there's this gap in my career history, and especially in finance. Being infantry does not necessarily add to your resume around finance. And so I just found it sort of difficult to where I did have a bachelor's degree, but also there's so many bachelor's degrees out there. So it actually was a process of finding a job, getting myself out there. And at the same time, it took me a while to actually understand that I was struggling through something for a long time because I was high performing. I could kind of ignore some of this baggage or some of these extra weights that I was carrying that were really slowing me down. And it would often what it sort of manifested in, especially in the Ranger life, it's work hard, play hard. So alcoholism is a big part of the culture, which you can get away with when you're there because you're young and you're fit and you can get up and still run 5 miles even if you drink far too much. But then when you start going to the civilian world and you have to do sort of a 9-to-5 job, again, it's almost these two different bubbles that don't align. And so when I did find a job, a lot of these old habits and a lot of these issues that I was able to ignore for so long really started becoming very prominent in my face. And I'd just get to the end of the week after being in this job, this finance job, and just realize that I was starting to become more unhappy more days than I was happy. And this formula is really starting to shift towards this darkness. And red flags just started popping off.
Well, I was going to ask you about the fact that you have talked about, the alcohol use and, the fact that you were self-medicating. And probably at the time you thought you were just partying, but you were probably more apt to be self-medicating. There's so many people out there right now who are doing the same thing. They're at home, they're alone, they're medicating, and they don't even realize that they have a problem. I mean, what would you say to those people, first off, about what they should start to think about?
And I think one of the ways I was able to get around it in my own head is because I was still high performing. And so I'd still show up to work. I was doing a great job. I'd get, compliments from my boss. I'd get everything done. It's just at night or on weekends, I would, just go far too hard. But I was like, oh, well, I'm doing everything right. So why can't I unwind, or why can't I have a little bit of fun? But that's sort of this delusion that we tell ourselves. And no matter what, health wise, it's destroying a lot, and it was increasing my depression. But two, it is just sort of this escape. It's this easy answer that we're not addressing other sort of things. But it's tricky for veterans too, because in the same situation that I was in, it was, okay, well, I either do this or I go to the VA and they give me a ton of medications. And so there wasn't like the alternative, because there was a period of time when I did start to realize it, where I'd wake up going to work on Monday and have to have a bottle of beer just to kind of, smooth things out and be able to go through the day. And there's other times when I would have to cut out of work because I would just have such high anxiety and panic attacks. And so these red flags started coming up. And so I did actually make that conscientious effort to, like, hey, this is not the life. You can't just do this Ranger lifestyle anymore. And I was just doing the one side of it. I was just the drinking part. I wasn't even like maintaining health or staying active or anything like that. So again, this delusion. But I tried to get back in shape. I tried to pick up a hobby, started cooking. I tried to do, meditation, journaling every morning. And I even went to the VA. And they all obviously helped, but I still just couldn't get past this wall. And so I really came into this sort of like paradoxical situation of like, all right, well, I know I'm drinking too much. But I don't, at the end of the day, if I'm like too anxious or stressed out, I just got caught in this loop of like, what else can I do? Like, this is helping me sort of survive right now, which is not the right answer, but I just couldn't figure out a solution out of it. It was either that or kind of medication. And that unfortunately seems to be the situation up until now, where a lot of people, if, the medication framework or the prolonged exposure therapy doesn't work for them, there's not other alternatives that are suggested to them, which is a very tragic sort of offering or position that people find themselves in.
Well, then you must have found yourself sitting in a situation where not rock bottom, but you just needed to get out of that cycle. What sent you on a journey to finding out about ayahuasca?
So I heard about it around that time. It was right after I went to the VA. Fortunately, so I went to the VA. Like I said, I was at this spot where red flags were showing up. Like some sort of internal voices were like, if you continue on this track, you're going to do something that you can't take back, whether, it's some sort of DUI or some sort of health thing or what have you. I just knew the track I was going on would end in something that I couldn't reverse. And so when I went to the VA, I told them all this stuff of how I was trying to help myself, but I was still managing. And they said that, unless I was willing to go on medication, they really couldn't help me. And so that was kind of the last straw of like, okay, well, I guess I have to figure this on my own, because these professionals are not offering me any viable alternative to medication. So I heard about ayahuasca during that time. At first, I kind of just cast it off. I had the same stigmas as a lot of people that I encounter today, where like, oh, it's a psychedelic. You're just doing drugs in the wood, or it's another form of escapism. It's another non-answer. But for whatever reason, it planted the seed in my mind. I heard these stories of people having these big changes. And, I guess just bored at work, I started doing more research, saw there was some reasoning behind it. And no matter what, there wasn't like a clear, concise answer. It was just some part of my subconscious was just telling me like, whatever you're doing right now is not working. We don't know what that is, but at least it is a chance.
Did you
And
start doing some research on your own? I mean, like digging into it, finding out whether or not there's any legitimate science behind it?
yeah, absolutely. And so there was a little bit, not a lot, because of the illegality of these substances similar to cannabis. It's just been nearly impossible to do any real research. But there was a lot of anecdotal evidence. There was some early scientific evidence. And to me, what appealed to me, I think, the most versus some other uh, drugs that might be recreational or considered recreational was it has this rich sort of indigenous tradition. So I think in my mind, it was like, okay, well, I don't really know what this is, but at least there's this cultural dynamic to it. There's a ceremony around it. That'd be very cool to experience. And that was kind of, I think, my lie to myself to like, or not lie to myself, but it was my entryway to make it okay that I wasn't just in my room, doing some drugs or something like that. So for whatever reason, my intuition just guided me there, and so I made that decision of like, all right, this job's not working. This whatever lifestyle's not working. So I essentially put in my 2 weeks notice. Fortunately, I had saved enough money to where I had some financial flexibility. And I essentially just bought a one-way ticket to Peru. And after doing some research of spots that I felt comfortable with. And so I ventured there and went to this ayahuasca retreat.
And I mean, that must have been, not just an eye opener, but I mean, you show up in Peru, a foreign country, to take a substance that you're not sure whether or not you're getting the real deal or whatever. I mean, talk a little bit about that journey there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of mixed emotions. I mean, it was a big change, and I didn't know if I was making the right decision. I thought it was kind of crazy of leaving this good job and just going. But on the other side, there was a sigh of relief of just traveling and getting out of this bubble where I could kind of self-reflect of how bad or how long I had let it go and some of this really reckless behavior that I was engaged in. So it was a big contemplative moment. But fortunately, uh, I've learned to trust strong intuition impulses, and they've almost always led me correctly. It was one of the reasons I joined the military, and this was almost the next sort of transition of almost a life-saving impulse, which unfortunately I do have. And so when I went there, kind of nervous, but had the excitement of being in a new culture. And Peru, I'd been in Latin America before, so it was nice to be back. I'd done a decent amount of research, so I felt secure of where I was going. The place was located in the city called Iquitos, Peru, which is pretty remote. It's a sizable city, but it's pretty remote. And you have to fly in there. You have to take a boat. You have to. It's a journey to get to the retreat, but the retreat itself was beautiful. It was isolated. It was in the middle of the Amazon, and so still kind of nervous, especially have never done any psychedelics to ayahuasca, which is a pretty powerful one. It was even leading up to the first ceremony. It was just it was almost like going into selection again of like I don't know what meat grinder I'm going to go through, but I'm here for a reason.
Talk a little bit about the experience. I mean, so you arrive at the retreat, who you met, how they talk to you, how did they prep you for it, and talk me through your first trip.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got there, and then the first day, it's everybody's meeting each other for the first time. It was other travelers from all over the world, a group about let's say 15 to 20. I can't remember exactly, but it was all very nice people, all there for their own reasons, all there to heal. Some had been returned. They had gone before and were speaking very highly about the positive benefits they had experienced. Others, it was their first time. And so sort of the first day you get there, find where you're going to stay, kind of do the tour around it, kind of the basic intro. And then generally how these retreats work, the kind of more modern ayahuasca retreats are a week long, and then you have the opportunity to participate in 4 ayahuasca ceremonies during that time. And so the first one it'll generally happen across the week. And so for people who don't know, ayahuasca is, it's been used for thousands of years by indigenous tribes across the Amazon for, health, mental health, spirituality, connectivity of the tribe. They in their belief, it helps them sort of guide through the forest as well. So the healers, commonly called shaman or curanderos, are the ones that are the experts. They guide the ceremony. They're the ones that have been doing sort of training with these plants so that they're sort of the experts of how to do it. And it's basically the combination of two Amazonian plants, a vine and a leaf. And the combination of those causes this very intense psychedelic experience when they're cooked together and distilled and made into this tea. And so when you drink the tea, you have this that lasts for about 4 hours. It often brings up subconscious trauma. It often brings up very strong emotions that you haven't been dealing with, which is why it's potentially very beneficial.
Do you remember this? Why? Do you remember what happened during your trip, or does somebody have to inform you? Or when you say it brings up all these emotions, you are not consciously aware of what you're doing.
No, well, you are in it. I mean, you don't necessarily have the control over the experience, but you are in it. It's almost like a lucid dream on steroids, where it's sort of like in this dreamlike world where you understand what's going on and you recognize things, but it doesn't necessarily follow Earth physics or awake physics. And so it's almost like, those dreams where you have, and when you go to sleep very anxious, and then your dream interprets that anxiety of being late for a test or being late for a meeting. So it kind of operates in the same way, where the hallucinations that you have are oftentimes metaphors for some trauma, but sometimes it's direct too. So we've worked with a lot of veterans that actually had childhood trauma, and it'll transport them right back to the scene of where it happened, to where they have to not necessarily, it's not sort of this punishment. It's not that they have to experience it, but it allows them to process it. It allows them to actually complete the story, to where it's not this sort of point of contention that continues to eat away at them. It's through that processing, through that experiencing the motion, that they're able to move through. And because you're in this sort of altered state, it almost allows you to zoom out from yourself. So it's not like you're experiencing that punishment again. You're almost in a protected sort of side of it. So you do remember it, but there can be so much, and there can be so much visual input and things that are even beyond comprehension or beyond words that, might fade or you might not remember. But generally speaking, most people will remember how it sort of manifested in their head.
And does the counselor or the shaman, the person who's taking you through this experience, have they sat down and spoken to you about what might come out, so that they at least are there to help you get through, or they just experience it with you?
Yeah, so absolutely. Generally, and that's sort of what we've created with Heroic Hearts, of a more sort of streamlined approach, to where people are fully prepared and they know what they're in for, without bringing expectations. We don't want people to go there being like, this is exactly what I want, but we want them to know what to be prepared for. And so at these retreat centers, they will talk about it. There's this whole practice of intentions of what are you looking to explore here? So if you have anxiety, if you have depression, is that like, what are you looking to find the cause of that? Are you looking at heart, your emotions? Are you looking to sort of figure out what's causing these negative patterns? So they will talk to you. They will sort of guide you through it. And then actually during the ceremony, how it happens is you go in there. They generally happen at night. There's this ceremonial hut called a maloka, and people walk in. They're sitting around it with the shaman either at the center or at one of the main points. And everybody will take their turn drinking the ayahuasca tea, and then they'll go sit down. And then generally within the half an hour to an hour, then that's when the psychedelic experience starts to hit. And in each tradition is different. Like I said, there's a lot of different tribes that use it differently, but generally there's a singing component. And so that's sort of the training of the shaman, where their songs are called Icaros, and they learn them from their own experience of in their tradition. The plants teach them these songs, and it helps them guide sort of the trauma or the bad energy. And so people go in there, and so you're in the psychedelic state, but then it's being guided by the songs, by the emotional nature of the songs. And it's actually pretty unique. It's one of those things that's very hard to describe to somebody that hasn't experienced it. But the vast majority of people, when they come out of it, they're like, I don't know how you could do this experience without the songs. It's such an integral part of it. And even now, when we're doing modern sort of psychotherapy with psychedelics, like you mentioned, the Johns Hopkins using psilocybin, or there's studies with MDMA, or any of these mind-altering substances, it almost always has a musical component. Because what they found is that we're so connected to music especially in these altered states, that it really helps us guide us through these traumas. It really helps us guide or be sort of a messenger through these journeys, but then also helps us purge some of these strong emotions. So if the song kind of has more of a intense beat, that might be something that you need to really get deep into it. If it has a softer, more emotional, then that might you tend to hear a lot of people start crying or start really having those sort of emotions. And so through the process, it's a very all experiential sort of thing. So
And
in
so when you after you had your first experience, when you came out of it, became more aware, became lucid again, what
yeah,
was the first thoughts that you had?
my first thoughts were, what the hell is that? My first few ceremonies were intense. They're essentially all out war, and one that kind of gave me respect for it, because it wasn't this happy-go-lucky, trip escapism through the woods. It was actual work. It was intensity. It was something that I didn't understand, but that had such power over me. And so I came into it with some fear, but really a lot of respect. And so for me, my journey was very hard, because just I've learned so much, especially in the military mind, to compartmentalize and to control all the variables around me, that this substance that you kind of have to relinquish control and you kind of have to go with sort of the flow of it, was very hard for me. I didn't want to like give up my conscientiousness, my sobriety. I didn't want to like go into it, but you have to. And eventually you are like, it's going to win, no matter, you're just making it more difficult. So through the process, my whole learning experience, which it actually in the experience in a hard to explain way, it actually guided me to learn that, was to relinquish this control, was to sort of surrender myself to it, to allow some of this compartmentalized trauma to escape, because I was just holding on to it so dearly. And so for a while, it was just me fighting against it and just puking a lot, just having this very intense, like sweating and just not being able to stay still, and just very, very intense, very uncomfortable. But because of that struggle, it allowed me to better, afterwards, after all four ceremonies, I felt relieved. I felt lighter. My brain felt like it had been almost reset and recalibrated to where it was actually functioning much better. And those benefits continued to last. So on the immediate side, I just felt sort of this immediate sort of, all one connectivity, where my brain seemed to be working better. It seemed to be better connected to my body. It just seemed to be lighter, to where I wasn't holding the same weight that I felt was, somewhat crushing me. And when I was in Tampa at my job, but then even continuous, I just continued to notice changes and benefits, to where things in the past that would trigger my anxiety or make me more susceptible all of a sudden didn't. I could just kind of sidestep that anxiety, and I could react to the situation without this burden of having this anxious reaction side of it. So, and I just saw all these other amazing stories too, of people overcoming some pretty severe stuff, whether OCD, anxiety, neuroticism. And so just really affirmed that there was something to this beyond what the stigmas and the common knowledge had led me to believe.
And that's what brought you to wanting to make sure you made this, or try to help make this available to other veterans. So you decided to start the Heroic Hearts Project. Is that right?
Absolutely. So that was the inspiration of it. After trying a lot of stuff, like I said, this was such a huge relief. And so one, it gave me respect for, plants in general, even more so for cannabis. I was always, to each their own. It wasn't for me, but I didn't really see the medical value. And so after this, I really understood of like, there's a lot more to these plants, these substances, than we realize that we give credit to, just because it doesn't fall into the traditional scientific model. And so that was the inspiration for Heroic Hearts. As you mentioned, the veteran community is going through a suicide epidemic, and even those that don't make that decision are actively destroying their lives, whether through alcoholism, whether through, just ruining their family, their social network. And so at that point, I didn't really know what I had, or I didn't really know what the concept was, but I did know there's something to this. And it might not be for everybody, but for those that are on a similar path to me, I wanted to make it easier. I wanted to educate and facilitate, so they didn't have to do like this Google search into the deep web to try to figure out what was going on here. And so that was the start of Heroic Hearts, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. So one, to educate. As you know, veterans kind of have their own language, like any other profession. Of if you hear it from a veteran, it's probably going to, be more appealing or take more hold than if it comes from somebody else. And so approach this topic in sort of a way that veterans will understand, but then also facilitate. So for the past 4.5 years, we've created this program where a veteran comes to us. The vast majority have tried everything the VA has had to offer, fallen through the cracks, at some point been on all sorts of medication, and just were left almost hopeless, almost at the end of the rope. So they fill out an application. We do basic safety checks, making sure there's not contraindications, making sure they're generally healthy, because this can be an intense experience. We provide coaching, sort of that preparation, integration support I was talking about, like a month or two out, where once they get there, they're still going to be apprehensive, but they know what they're getting into and they know how to handle it better than I was prepared. And then we work with a lot of different centers around the world, and each one we vetted to make sure that it's safe, make sure that they're aligned, make sure it's sustainable, make sure that they're comfortable working with vets, because it is a very specific demographic to work with. And then the aftercare, which is the most important. And this is what we always relay to everybody. Whatever it is, there's no magic pill. There's no one size fits all solution to this. Psychedelics can really help out traditional therapy, traditional talk therapy. It can get people tremendous breakthroughs in a very short period of time. And it can have a lot of long lasting benefits, both on a psychological and a physical basis. But the person still needs to make the right decisions. They still need to take that opportunity to change their life in a positive way. So if somebody goes from, one of our retreats straight back to the bar, straight back to, whatever else they're doing, it's probably not going to have as much of a benefit. But if they really take that time afterward, when they feel great, where they know what they're capable of, and make positive life choices, where, they incorporate things in their life of exercising more, eating healthier, meditation, yoga, a lot of people pick up, then it's really going to change your life in transition. All of this is creating sort of those positive connections in our brain, and this helps reset that, so you're not beholden to the negative connections that we just kept building up. And so that's
go ahead. I was glad. I'm sorry.
No, so that's sort of the program we've created, and after the community, and I'm sure, as you know, of what you've been trying to build, is we need mutual support. Peer support is the absolute key to all of this. We need to start supporting each other. We need to check in with each other. We need to make sure others are okay, to build those networks, and that is the absolute key.
Well, talk to me a little bit about this partnership that you've now formed with Imperial College in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. So ayahuasca is sort of the start, obviously the start of my story. But all these substances, again, cannabis, psychedelics, psilocybin, they all work as long as when you're using it in sort of this therapeutic fashion, especially psychedelics, they all work in a similar sort of way. Each one has a slightly different chemical variation, and so research will in the future show what those differences are. But at the end of the day, they're all very powerful. They can all be very effective for veterans. And so we've worked with ayahuasca, we've worked with a substance called ibogaine, we've worked with ketamine clinics, and also psilocybin. And so this research, because psilocybin, as you mentioned at the top of the show, is getting more and more popularity. It's a little bit more palatable. It's a little bit more digestible than some of these other psychedelics, which are still stigmatized. So more people are familiar with mushrooms and psilocybin. There's more businesses that are starting, that are, figuring out an economic model. And so there's more research, like Johns Hopkins, like Stanford, all these major universities. So we decided to do our own study, like we mentioned before, where a very underdiagnosed problem with military veterans is the head trauma. Is what factor does that play into what we're seeing in a psychological basis? What's being often diagnosed as PTSD exclusively. So we're doing our normal retreats as we would with ayahuasca. For American veterans and Canadian veterans, it'll be in Jamaica. For UK veterans, because we have a UK branch, it'll be in the Netherlands. So these veterans will go there and participate in 2 major psilocybin ceremonies, which will be supported. There'll be integration. They'll be in a very beautiful, comfortable spot. And then alongside our partnership with Imperial College of London, they will be taking results of those applicants that are willing to do it. So it's an observational study. There's no obligation on veterans, but we try to track as much data as possible. And so we're going to do a whole series of measurements of psychological evaluations, psychological surveys, EEGs, which is the brain scans, some biological samples, really just to try to figure out what effects psilocybin, bigger doses, has physically on the brain for veterans with traumatic brain injury. So
we do know that there's research out there that seems to indicate that it has an anti-inflammatory response in the brain, has a neuroprotective response in the brain, correct?
Absolutely. So the early research is showing potential anti-inflammatory effects, which is huge for traumatic brain injury, that the inflammation causes all sorts of imbalance in hormone levels, which has a lot of other bad effects online. Possible neurogenesis, so creating new neurons, and possible increased plasticity. So those that have damage, increased plasticity can kind of rewire the brain to make it function almost normal, despite whatever the injury is.
You're finding pathways of damage.
Exactly. And so that's what we're trying to find. So for these psilocybin, we're looking for vets with brain trauma, whether diagnosed or just a high exposure to what we mentioned before, concussive force, mortar blast, IED blast, and then get them to these retreats, and it'll all be covered. And if they are willing, do the research. And so our partnership with Imperial College is wonderful. They've been at the forefront under Robin Carhart Harris and Professor Nutt of advancing psilocybin research. They're very well respected. They have a lot of great data already. And so we're honored to be working with them on this project.
And if people wanted to figure out how they can get involved to help veterans get through your Heroic Heroes program, or how would they do it? How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so in terms of that, in terms of those retreats or our ayahuasca retreats, people can go to heroicheartsproject.org. We are currently recruiting for the psilocybin retreats. We're also looking for fundraising. So if you want to help us support and really help us advance science, please reach out through the website, heroicheartsproject.org. We're also in all major social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all Heroic Hearts Project. Just look that up. We are a nonprofit, so donations are the way that we move forward. It's the gas in the tank. So anybody who is willing to want to help vets, this has been one of the most effective ways of ending veteran suicide, of curing sort of the PTSD epidemic. So please, if you have the means to support, reach out to us. It's very easy to donate through the website. And we also offer specialty retreats for those that want to experience it with veterans. So we've had some executive retreats where we've had CEOs, athletes, veterans. It's pretty impactful, powerful ceremonies when we have all these different groups together.
And we're going to start seeing in the future here lots of different groups coming together, because I'm guaranteeing that this entire idea of PTSD and mental trauma, though it may not be concussive trauma, the trauma that we just experienced from this pandemic is going to be with us for a long time. And there is a lot of science that says that this may also be helpful with people who've had to go through that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the mental health is something we really need to come to terms with. As you said, COVID has just made it even worse. And fortunately, we are living in a time when there are more tools, but it is something we need to take seriously. Whether it's cannabis, whether it's psychedelics, there needs to be more funding. There needs to be more research, which there is not. And there needs, as you mentioned also, there needs to be funding for things that aren't necessarily making these major companies a lot of money, because there are very effective treatments out there. And mental health needs to be one of the main focuses going forward, because it is dramatically affecting a lot of lives, and that has huge ripples in terms of economic prosperity, in terms of country stability, in terms of all levels of stability.
Absolutely. Well, Jesse Gould, I can't thank you enough for being a part of Let's Be Blunt with Montel today. I know people are going to find this really exciting. So I'm going to thank you, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in to Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback also, so please send us your comments.